The dusty streets of General Santos City seemed narrower than Manny remembered. The humid heat of the Philippines embraced his face as he walked discreetly through the neighborhood where he'd grown up, wearing only a simple t-shirt and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He had decided to visit his old house alone, without bodyguards or assistants, driven by an inexplicable nostalgia that had overtaken him during preparations for his official retirement from boxing. With each step, vivid memories flooded his mind. There was the corner where he'd sold cigarettes at 7 years old to help his family. Further ahead, the empty lot where he'd improvised his first ring with old ropes and torn sandbags. The smell of fried food and distant sound of karaoke mixed with the noise of passing jeepneys, creating a familiar symphony that transported him directly back to his childhood of hardship and impossible dreams. When he finally spotted the small wooden and zinc house where he'd lived with his mother and siblings, his heart tightened. The structure remained practically unchanged, with the same peeling paint and small dirt-packed yard. A wave of gratitude and melancholy washed over him as he realized how far he'd come from that humble place, but also how important those roots continued to be for him. It was then that something unusual caught his attention. Sitting in a white plastic chair, leaning against the gate of the house next door, was a middle-aged man with a tired appearance but alert eyes. He wore a faded shirt and patched shorts, and in his hands, he held a yellowed newspaper clipping. There was something in his posture, a respectful vigilance that made Manny slow his pace and observe him with curiosity. The man hadn't recognized him yet, but remained there, motionless, as if he'd been waiting for something or someone for a very long time. Manny felt a mixture of intrigue and compassion, never imagining that he was about to discover one of the most touching stories of his life, one that would forever change his perspective on the true meaning of fame and recognition. Manny pretended to examine some details of the old house while discreetly observing the man in the chair. There was something deeply familiar about that figure. Though he couldn't identify exactly what, the stranger kept his eyes fixed on the direction of the Pacquiao family's former residence, with a patience that bordered on devotion. His calloused hands carefully held the newspaper clipping, as if it were a precious treasure that could fall apart at any moment. Curiosity overcoming caution, Manny approached slowly, still maintaining his casual disguise. He could see that the paper in the man's hands was an old clipping from a local newspaper, with a black and white photo of a young, thin, and determined boxer. The image was faded by time, but was unmistakably himself at 16 years old, after one of his first significant amateur victories. The article had been published more than 25 years ago. The man, who appeared to be about 50 years old, had typical Filipino features, sun-weathered skin, and hands that told stories of hard work. His eyes, however, shone with a special light whenever he looked at the house, as if he could see something that no one else could see. There was a serenity in his vigil that deeply touched Manny, reminding him of the first fans who had supported him when no one else believed in his potential. When their gazes finally met, the man smiled shyly, showing no sign of recognition. To him, Manny was just another curious visitor to the neighborhood. This reaction, or lack thereof, intrigued the champion even more. He was accustomed to being recognized instantly anywhere in the Philippines, but there, ironically close to where it all began, he found someone who looked at him merely as an ordinary human being. Manny felt a strange liberation in that momentary anonymity. He decided to take advantage of the opportunity to discover more about that mysterious man, without revealing his identity. There was something about that situation that awakened his genuine curiosity, a need to understand what kept someone sitting there, guarding memories of a time that seemed to have been forgotten by everyone except himself. Approaching with the naturalness of a local resident, Manny greeted the man with a friendly wave. The stranger returned the gesture with typical Filipino courtesy, inviting him to sit in a second plastic chair that he always kept beside him, as if he were perpetually waiting for company. He introduced himself simply as Balong, a common name in the region, and explained that he had lived there for decades, always in that same modest house next to the Pacquiao family's former residence. As they chatted about neighborhood pleasantries, Manny noticed how Balong spoke with nostalgic affection about the old times, when the streets were quieter and families knew each other intimately. His words carried a gentle melancholy, like someone who had witnessed many changes and remained as a silent guardian of the place's memories. The newspaper clipping never left his hands, handled with the care of someone protecting something sacred. When Manny casually asked about the house next door, Balong's eyes lit up with surprising passion. He began to tell, without being asked, about an extraordinary family that had lived there years ago. He spoke about a brave mother who had raised her children alone, facing unimaginable difficulties, and about a special boy who dreamed of becoming a boxer. His words painted a vivid portrait of struggle, determination, and hope that made Manny's heart race. Balong described how he used to watch young Manny train in the backyard, using improvised bags and moving with a natural grace that caught the attention of even the most skeptical neighbors. He remembered the mornings when the boy would run through the streets before dawn, always with a smile on his face despite the family's obvious difficulties. There was genuine reverence in his voice, as if he were talking about a saint or personal hero. What impressed Manny most was the wealth of detail that Balong kept in his memory. He remembered small acts of kindness from the young boxer, like helping elderly neighbors carry groceries or sharing his meager school lunch with children even more needy. These were memories that Manny himself had forgotten, but which remained vivid in that simple man's mind, as if each moment had been photographed in his heart with loving precision. As the conversation deepened, Balong revealed the reason for his constant presence at that location. He explained that since the Pacquiao family had moved to a better house, he had assumed a kind of informal vigil over the old residence, not out of obligation or anyone's request, but because of an inexplicable feeling of duty and gratitude. He deeply believed that one day, the boy who had become world champion would return to his origins, and he wanted to be there to witness that moment. For more than 15 years, Balong had maintained this silent routine. Every morning, after completing his work as a construction helper, he would return home and take his position in the plastic chair. He had watched dozens of people visit the abandoned house, curious tourists who came to take photos and leave quickly, but he remained, patiently waiting for an encounter that many would consider impossible or naive. His unwavering faith impressed even the neighbors, who initially mocked his apparently fruitless dedication. Over the years, however, the community began to respect him as a kind of guardian of local memories. Children grew up hearing his stories about the famous boxer, and many adults came to consider him an almost mythical figure in the neighborhood, someone who kept alive the connection with one of the region's most illustrious sons. The newspaper clipping he carried was just one of many Manny-related belongings that Balong had collected over the years. In his simple house, he maintained a small collection of clippings, photos, and even objects that had belonged to the Pacquiao family, left behind during the move. They weren't valuable treasures in the material sense, but represented a pure and selfless devotion that deeply touched the disguised champion's heart. Manny began to understand that he was witnessing something rare and precious, a fan who loved him not for fame or achievements, but for the human being he had known in his most authentic form. Balong wasn't interested in autographs, photos, or recognition. His vigil was an act of pure love, a way of honoring the memories of someone who had inspired his own life in ways he couldn't even fully explain. As the sun began to set over General Santos City, painting the sky with golden and orange hues, Balong continued sharing his memories with growing emotion. He revealed how Manny's trajectory had profoundly influenced his own life, inspiring him never to give up in the face of adversity. He told of difficult moments when everything seemed lost, he would remember the determined boy who trained in the yard next door and find strength to continue. Balong described how he had followed each fight on television over the years, celebrating victories as if they were his own achievements and suffering through the rare defeats like a worried father. His house became an informal gathering point during the big fights, where neighbors would come together to cheer and celebrate. He had become a kind of official historian of Manny's achievements in the community, someone who knew every detail of the career like few others. What most moved Manny was discovering how his story had intertwined with Balong's in ways he had never imagined. The man revealed that he had named his own son, born in the same year as Manny's first major international victory, Emmanuel, in honor of his idol. He spoke about how he had used the boxer's trajectory as a constant example for the boy, teaching him about perseverance, humility, and the importance of never forgetting one's origins. Balong also shared how he had created a small personal tradition. With each important victory of Manny's, he would plant a new flower in the small garden in front of the old Pacquiao house. Over the years, the space had transformed into a colorful and well-maintained garden, a kind of silent altar dedicated to the champion's achievements. Neighbors had come to affectionately call the place the Champion's Garden, though few fully understood the depth of the symbolism. The conversation revealed not just the devotion of a fan, but the story of how one person can profoundly impact another's life without even knowing it. Manny realized that his journey had created waves of inspiration that spread far beyond rings and arenas, touching lives in intimate and transformative ways. The realization that he had served as a source of hope for someone like Balong filled him with gratitude that words couldn't adequately express. Manny's heart was beating fast as he observed Balong's genuine devotion. The moment had come for a crucial decision: reveal his identity or maintain the anonymity that had allowed him to learn this extraordinary story. The internal struggle was intense, as he knew that the revelation would completely change the conversation's dynamic and possibly the purity of that unexpected encounter. On the other hand, he felt he owed something to that faithful man who had dedicated years of his life keeping alive the memory of a poor boy who had dared to dream big. While Balong continued talking about his hopes of one day meeting his idol, even if just to thank him for the inspiration received, Manny made his decision. Slowly, he removed the cap that partially concealed his face and looked directly into the man's eyes. For a few seconds, there was only silence as recognition gradually formed in Balong's expression. His eyes widened, the newspaper clipping trembled in his hands, and an indescribable emotion took over his features. Balong's reaction was unlike anything Manny had experienced before. There were no euphoric screams, desperate requests for autographs, or attempts to take photos. Instead, silent tears began to stream down the weathered face of the man while he remained seated, as if fearing that any sudden movement might make that moment disappear like a dream. His voice came out in a choked whisper, simply repeating the name Manny like a prayer of gratitude. The champion approached and, in a spontaneous gesture, embraced the man who had waited for him for so many years. In that embrace, decades of silent admiration found their destiny, and two lives that had touched each other indirectly finally connected tangibly. Balong was crying openly now, not from sadness, but from a pure and overwhelming joy that made his entire body tremble. His words came out broken, mixing thanks in Tagalog and English, expressing gratitude that went far beyond sporting achievements. Manny was also deeply moved, realizing that this encounter represented something much greater than he had initially understood. It wasn't just about a fan meeting his idol, but about the recognition of rare and genuine loyalty, a form of love that transcended fame and touched the deepest human essence. In that moment, under the Filipino sky tinted with the colors of dusk, two souls met in their most authentic and vulnerable form. In the minutes following the revelation, Manny and Balong remained in respectful silence, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. The champion then asked to see the collection of memories that Balong had mentioned, and together they walked to the man's simple house. The interior, though modest, revealed itself to be a true sanctuary dedicated to Manny's trajectory, with clippings organized chronologically, faded photos, and small objects that told the story of admiration built over decades. Balong showed each item with the care of a museum curator, explaining when and where he had obtained each piece. There were fight programs autographed by other people, tickets to matches he could never afford to attend in person, and even a children's boxing glove that had belonged to young Manny, forgotten during the family's move. Each object represented not just a memory, but an emotional investment that demonstrated the depth of his devotion. What touched Manny most was discovering a handwritten diary that Balong had kept for years, where he recorded his reflections on each fight, each victory, and each significant moment in the boxer's career. The yellowed pages contained not just sporting results, but personal observations about how each event had impacted his own life and that of the local community. It was an intimate and loving chronicle that revealed how a simple man had found meaning and inspiration in another's journey. Manny asked permission to read some passages from the diary and was deeply moved to discover how his fights had served as metaphors for Balong's personal challenges. The man had used the champion's victories as a source of courage to face financial difficulties, family health problems, and moments of despair. Each of Manny's conquests had become proof that dreams could come true, regardless of initial circumstances. When Balong timidly mentioned that he had always dreamed of meeting his idol in person, not to ask for anything, but simply to express his gratitude, Manny felt a deep emotional responsibility. He understood that this encounter was not coincidence, but an opportunity to reciprocate, even in a small way, the unconditional loyalty he had received. He decided he would do something special for that extraordinary man, something that would honor the purity of his devotion without turning it into a spectacle. In the weeks following the encounter, Manny maintained discreet contact with Balong, visiting him regularly without fanfare or publicity. He discovered that the man faced some financial difficulties, working temporary construction jobs that barely covered his basic needs. His son Emmanuel, now a teenager, dreamed of studying engineering, but the family lacked resources to afford quality higher education. It was a situation that echoed Manny's own childhood, creating an even deeper connection between the two men. Without making a big fuss, Manny discreetly organized a way to help Balong's family. Not through grand gestures or spectacular donations, but respectfully and preserving the dignity of the man he so admired. He arranged a stable job for Balong at a construction company, where he had influence, and created a small scholarship for Emmanuel, presented as a local community program to prevent the family from feeling embarrassed. Most importantly, however, was the genuine friendship that developed between them. Manny began visiting Balong regularly, not as a celebrity doing charity, but as a friend valuing an authentic connection. They would sit in the same plastic chairs where they had met, talking about life, shared memories, and future dreams. For Manny, those moments became precious refuges from the constant pressure of fame, places where he could simply be himself. Balong continued his daily vigil, but now with transformed meaning. He no longer waited for an encounter that might never happen, but maintained alive a tradition that had become an integral part of his identity. His plastic chair became a symbol of loyalty and perseverance for the entire community, and his stories about Manny gained new richness and authenticity, now based on direct personal experiences. The garden that Balong had planted in honor of Manny's victories flourished even more, becoming a small local landmark where people came seeking inspiration and reflection. It wasn't a grandiose monument, but a simple and powerful testament to how human greatness can be measured not only by public achievements, but by the ability to deeply touch other lives. For Manny, that garden represented one of the greatest victories of his life, the discovery that he had been loved not for what he had conquered, but for who he truly was in his purest and most authentic essence. Years later, when journalists asked about his most memorable moments, Manny frequently mentioned not his greatest fights in world rings, but that silent evening in General Santos City, when he discovered that true success in life is measured not only by titles and recognition, but by the ability to inspire genuine love and unconditional loyalty in hearts as simple and pure as Balong's.
Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next cases.